Is Ukraine endangering its own civilians? Amnesty International accuses Kiev of putting its own people at risk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy responds with fury, but the right group stands by its claims. I'm Jafar Hasnand, and this is the Newsmakers. When it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, Russia is normally the one accused of wrongdoing, but Amnesty International says Kiev is also guilty of misconduct. The report released last week says that Ukrainian forces have been using hospitals as de facto military bases. They have routinely set up bases in schools, in towns and villages in Donbass and in the Mykolaiv area. But they also go on to say that the military's practice of locating military objectives within populated areas does not in any way justify indiscriminate Russian attacks. The report has drawn widespread criticism, including from Ukraine's president, who accuses the right group of victim blaming.
We saw today a completely different report from Amnesty International, which unfortunately tries to amnesty the terrorist state and shift the responsibility from the aggressor to the victim. There are no and can be no, even hypothetically, conditions under which any Russian attack on Ukraine becomes justified. Aggression against our state is unprovoked, invasive, and frankly terroristic. And if someone prepares a report in which the victim and the aggressor are allegedly the same in some way, if some data about the victim is analyzed while something that the aggressor was doing at that time is ignored, then this cannot be tolerated.
Even within Amnesty's ranks, there is disagreement over the report. The group's head in Ukraine, Oksana Pokalchuk, quit after its release, suggesting it had become a tool of Russian propaganda. Taking to Facebook, she said,
"This is another loss that the war has cost me. My favorite job, 7 years of my life, plans for the future, and the last 5 months. Also a rescue circle in the form of human rights, work for the benefit of the homeland during the war. Everything crashed against the wall of bureaucracy and deaf language barrier. It's not English, but if you don't live in a country that's been invaded by invaders and tearing it apart, you probably don't understand what it's like to condemn the Defense Army. And there are no words in any language that are able to deliver it to someone who has not felt this pain."
Amnesty has responded to the backlash, saying it regrets the distress the report has caused, but it stands by what's in it. In a statement sent to the Newsmakers, it said,
"The findings in our press release documenting the Ukrainian military's violations of international humanitarian law were based on evidence gathered during extensive on-the-ground investigations. We have clearly and categorically condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an unjustified act of aggression and a violation of international law, and have repeatedly documented war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. Our research into Russia's violations of the laws of war is ongoing. However, we also believe it is crucial to respond impartially. When we find Ukrainian violations of international humanitarian law, as we did in this case, we will report them fairly and accurately. Ignoring violations committed by either side in any conflict would not be meaningful human rights reporting."
And joining me now from Kiev is Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, a non-profit organization aiming to reinforce democratic institutions in post-Soviet countries. Sergey Markov is in Moscow. He's a political science professor at Moscow State Institute of International Relations and a former member of the Russian parliament. And in Sheffield is Colin Alexander, a senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham, Trent University. Thanks all for being with us here on the Newsmakers today. Peter, I would like to begin with you. What do you make of Amnesty International's report?
Well, obviously, I'm very disappointed, not only because I'm a Ukrainian, but also was a human rights activist for many years when I lived in the United States. No one put it better than the British newspaper, The Times, in its article regarding this report. It's called The Times View on Amnesty International Ukraine Report, Putin's Propagandists. It compared what they saw in its report to the views expressed by the pacifist writer Vera Brittain, who, when she heard about the death camps of 1945, I'm quoting, she said that this was partly in order to divert attention from the havoc produced in German cities by Allied obliteration bombing. So, as some have already stated, the basic problem with this report is that it fails to grasp the moral distinction between a just cause and an evil one, and then tries to really reason with military tactics of Ukrainians who are defending themselves in the situation where the Russians have targeted civilian areas, just like they've done anywhere else throughout their recent history, in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, now throughout Ukraine. They have, in fact, boxed Ukrainians in where they have nowhere else to go but to the civilian areas, to protect the population there, to evacuate them. All of these factors, their report conveniently ignores. And let me just say, I think no one, no one criticized it any more precisely than their own director in Kiev, a lady, Oksana, who resigned as a result of this report.
Okay, so I think it's clear that you don't find this report credible at all. But let me ask you here, Peter, what do you make of Amnesty International report where it accuses Moscow of war crimes?
Well, in all fairness, even in their rebuttal of all the criticism in their follow-up note, the Amnesty International staff says that it wants to demonstrate solidarity and has demonstrated solidarity with Ukrainians throughout this war. It has called for concrete action on behalf of Ukraine, and it also said that Russia alone is responsible for the violation.
So, if I may, the one accusing Moscow of war crimes is a credible one in your view?
Well, it is credible because all the predominant and the preponderant evidence is that Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine. And I think this is a trap a lot of these organizations sometimes fall into by trying to equate and say, well, on the one hand, we criticize this side, on the other hand, we criticize that. And there's just really no equation between the perpetrator of the crime and its victim.
Okay. Sergey, let me come to you. Now, Amnesty International's report also says that Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilians cannot be justified in any way. What do you make of that?
You just lie. Amnesty International is a political, first of all, organization which is part of such propagandistic political machine which fight against Russia in the hybrid war. And they just created fake news, and it's exactly propaganda of hybrid style which they used. Everybody knows that neo-Nazi is part of the Kiev regime, and I'm interested how Peter feels himself when he shakes hands to neo-Nazis who is on the every corner.
Okay, let's not get personal here, because I do have another question for you. So you basically do not find Amnesty International's latest report accusing Ukraine not credible at all, right? Because you call Amnesty International a tool for political propaganda.
Yes, of course. Amnesty International mentioned about 1% of the war crime and crime against humanity, which is conducted by Kiev repressive regime. And Amnesty International mentioned about deploying of some of the military capacity in the neighborhood, but it's not it's just very minimum. In fact, a Kiev regime used thousands of civilians and human shield in the style of the Islamic State. It's their main military policy to use civilians as human shield in the big cities.
Sergey, let me add one more question here. Now, as you say, Amnesty is a tool for political propaganda. Now, I'm applying your logic here. Whose propaganda was Amnesty International doing when it published this latest report?
When the Amnesty International published latest report about some of the crime against humanity of the Kiev regime, it's the crime of the propagandistic machine for whom very difficult to hide away so unhumorous war crime and crime against humanity. They just saying, oh, please, of course, do these war crimes which you are doing. But please try to hide away this. It's very difficult for us to proclaim Kiev regime as a democratic when it's obviously for everybody doing unhumorous war crime and crimes against humanity. It's exactly what's happening in torture and killing of Russian war prisoners, which Kiev regime started to do from the beginning. It was absolutely clear war crime, and in fact, United States political moderators, they ask Kiev regime not to do it.
Okay, but I have to say, most of the human rights groups, as of now, have accused Russia of war crime. Now, Colin, let me come to you here. Now, critics of this report also say that basically Amnesty International has ignored wartime realities. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, first of all, that if you're going to do a report like this, you are limited by the access that you have. And I take the points of both of my fellow discussants that, you know, it's pretty limited perspective that Amnesty has here. However, I would say that despite that limitation, the report is most likely true in terms of the specifics of what it says. It's true because we know that this happens in conflict, where civilian premises are attacked and where civilians are used as shields in one capacity or another. So you can go to the Battle of Homs in Syria about 10 years ago. You can go to the Sri Lankan Civil War, the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 2009, and you can see similar things. So ultimately, I think it's true for the specifics of it are true. We shouldn't be debating that. The other thing to say is that Amnesty International is a global NGO, and it tries, I think what you've just said this, it tries to operate without national prejudice. It has criticized both Russia and Ukraine, and also that Amnesty International will have thought long and hard about publishing something like this, because it goes against much of the grain of what international coverage has provided us in terms of it being mainly Russian aggression, Ukrainian defense, and this really, as I say, cuts against that. And I think the final point to say here is that just because Ukraine is in a defensive position in most of this conflict so far, doesn't excuse it or make it any less acceptable. It is still bound by codes of conduct and convention.
Okay. Peter, let me come to you now. I mean, I just want to pick up on one of the points made by Colin here. Now, Amnesty International is largely considered by many as a credible organization. I mean, it has accused both Russia and Ukraine when it comes to this conflict of wrongdoings, right? So, I mean, why is Kiev upset right now with this report when there were multiple reports filed by Amnesty International over the past 5 to 6 months in which it basically accused Russia of some horrific war crimes?
Well, let me just refer to some of the findings by our colleagues, Global Rights Compliance Law Firm and Foundation that's based here as well in Kiev and in Britain. I know these folks, I've worked with them and I've studied their documents. It's just simply the facts don't, the allegations in the Amnesty's report don't, correspond to any visible reality. What they have failed to follow a proper methodological approach when it comes to the international humanitarian law. They have essentially provided very scant evidence. They have said that they have interviewed witnesses and they have investigated Russian strike sites.
Okay, then,
no one knows.
if I may
who they
interject, what do you
interviewed.
think
And
motivated Amnesty International to come up with this report then?
Well, once again, I think it's this cockamamie and wrong idea to try to be fair and balanced just for the sake of it, just because the narrative goes against the Russian Federation and what they're doing in Ukraine. Let's try to be original. Let's see what the other side is doing in order to be seen as fair and balanced. And that's, once again, that is omitting the very central fact of this war, is that Russia is trying to obliterate Ukraine as an independent state.
Okay. Sergey, now one of the main things that have been highlighted in this report is that Russia is targeting civilians. Now, you could argue whether or not Ukraine intentionally placed its military in civilian populated areas, but tell me, how could you credibly claim to have been unaware that civilians were living in the targeted buildings? I mean, Russia has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world.
Just the fake news. It's one of the reasons why, by the way, Kiev against this human rights report, because they want to do war crime against humanity unlimitedly, and even some limitation create problem for him. But look what they're taking now. Maybe the Zaporozhye atomic power station, and Kiev regime and some of his propagandists, including Peter, they continue to say that this Zaporozhye atomic power station, which is under Russian control, it's under the anti-artillery attack of Russian army. And they nevertheless, they continue to say about this. And even General Secretary of United Nations, he prayed. He just say, we concerned about some artillery and rocket attack against this atomic power station, but he never mentioned who attack is this. It's exactly reflect the level of the shifting from the reality to the propagandistic picture. So they are just lying about Russian attacking civilians, because Russian is liberating people. These people, most of them Russian-speaking, as you know, all the south and east of Ukraine, and 90% of them Russian-speaking. And
Okay.
Ukrainian
Look at this. Look at the pictures, Mr. Host. May I just say something
Peter,
very
sure,
quickly?
sure.
Our viewers, as Mr. Markov is saying about Russian liberation, you can see in the pictures being provided in the footage how they're liberating our cities by destroying them. And they started with Russian-speaking areas, Kharkiv, Mariupol. That's the kind of liberation, Russian style.
And Colin, I will come to you, but let me add one more question here for Sergey. Sergey, now, since we're talking about Amnesty International, Amnesty International has also accused Russia of committing war crimes in Kharkiv. Sergey, what do you make of that?
That, of course, there are a lot of destroying cities, specifically Mariupol, because it has been used, civilians have been used as human shield by Ukrainian army. But look at what happened in World War II, when Germany had been, and then another countries, European countries, which had been occupied by German Wehrmacht, when they have been liberated from this Nazi occupation. Of course, a lot of civilians have been killed, and a lot of buildings and cities have been destroyed. Here is the same. Russian army liberated Ukraine from neo-Nazi regime. Now it's exactly as Red Army liberated Europe from Nazi regime during the World War II.
Okay, but if it's liberation, why is the Ukrainian army fighting back?
It's exactly as, because it's not army of Ukrainian people. It's proxy army. Ukrainian army is which an interesting army. It's Russian soldier plus neo-Nazi officer plus American general.
Okay.
It's very strong combination, and if you know, Wehrmacht also fight it until last days, defending criminal Nazi regime during World War II. Same happened with Ukrainian proxy army right now.
Okay. Now, I want to broaden the discussion. Colin, let me come to you. I mean, in a war-like situation, it's the civilians who pay the highest price, right? And I mean, it's pretty evident from what we have seen happen in Ukraine over the past 5 to 6 months. Hundreds of civilians have been killed. And now Amnesty International has accused both Ukraine and Russia of wrongdoing. I mean, the primary idea as human beings is to ensure that international humanitarian law is applied, is implemented in such a scenario. So how do you think countries like Ukraine, I want to talk about Ukraine first, how do you think countries like Ukraine can ensure that this law is implemented?
Well, I don't think that at the moment on a war footing, Ukraine has the luxury of being able to determine that. And ultimately, when any country, whether it's an offensive or a defensive country, moves onto a wartime footing, they very much limit their capacity for diplomacy, for discussion, to emphasize that humanitarian obligation, if you like. Look, war is a horrendous spectacle, and there is really no glory in it, and the truth disappears very quickly within war. You know, all glory in conflict is essentially just a fabrication. It's just the interpolation of propaganda messages that are seeking to distort the awfulness of conflict. And the only way that we move forward and progress as a human society and avoid the atrocities for which we're talking about today is to make warfare illegal and make the production of military equipment illegal. Ultimately, what we require is an international law which states that we should have the renunciation of warfare as an instrument of national policy and regardless of whether we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, or we're talking about United States, Great Britain, where I am, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, that's the end goal that we're looking at here. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen because, well, at least not in the immediate future, because too many powerful people, too many powerful organizations have such an interest in the continuation of warfare. And by interest, I mean a financial interest, a geostrategic interest. And as resources get scarcer, then we find greater competition for them.
Peter, I mean, Colin has made some very interesting points here. What is your navigation through them?
Well, I just, obviously in a kind of in an ideal world where there would never be war and would always be at peace and, pink unicorns, etc. And that's largely a realm of theory, just like it is, when we talk about complete denuclearization. In reality, there's something to be said about, the fact that the more nuclear armed states we have, the safer the world will be. It might sound counterintuitive, but there is this thing called nuclear peace theory. And you know what? If Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons in 1993 in exchange for Russian, security guarantees, we probably would not have gotten where we are right now. So that's the harsh reality. And we're dealing in a reality right now, quite apart from Colin's theoretical world, Platonic world of ideals. We are living in Ukraine under constant, shellings. Just a few moments ago, and there was another siren going off in Kiev, and we have to decide this. We have to fight for our country, and it's not helpful when we have this, renowned international organizations that willingly, allow themselves to be used as propaganda tools for the aggressor, which is the Russian Federation.
Okay, Sergey, would you like to respond to that? Well, okay, Collins, but be very quick though, because I do want
to. Fine.
Sergey.
The only reason that warfare continues to be a viable aspect of foreign policy is because of public acceptance for it. That public acceptance starts in childhood, where we are manufactured to believe that warfare is acceptable and is just part and parcel of our existence. Okay, propaganda is not just a part of warfare. Propaganda is absolutely fundamental to the continuation and the acceptance that we have warfare around the world.
Okay. Sergey, let me come to you now. What do you make of what Peter and Colin just said? But be very quick, though. We have about 30 seconds left.
To stop the war, we should make more justice in the world. And justice creating the war. In a situation when in Ukraine 70% is Russian speaking, and it's prohibited for them to use Russian, their native language of majority in official sphere and education sphere, so it's injustice. This creates war. When leaders of the main opposition party in Ukraine, as Viktor Michuk, sent to prison, it's injustice. It creates a war. When a lot of thousands of political activists who've been against the militant coup, overthrowing of democratic elected president in 2014, when they put to the prison, have been killed by neo-Nazis, it's injustice. It creates war. Make situation more justice, and there will be no war.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Peter, Zalmayev, Sergey Markov, Colin Alexander, thanks very much for talking to us here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.